Daniel 11 is one massive allegory. It's a continuation of the vision in chapter 10, and this time the angel explains basically everything. The vision begins by explaining that there will be 4 more kings after Cyrus the Great. These kings are probably Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes. Both Darius and Xerxes invade the Greeks, and with Artaxerxes the game changes a bit. Persia tries to disrupt the cities by pitting cities against cities, essentially causing disputes between the Greek city-states. The vision kind of skips the rest of the Persian kings and simply explains that Alexander the Great will crush the Persians. His empire is short-lived and breaks up into several kingdoms and empires. The rest of this chapter, verses 5 through 45, are about the wars between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucid Empire. The Ptolemies and Seleucids regularly go to war over the area of Syria and Palestine. In verse 6, the author alludes to a marriage between a daughter of the Ptolemies and the Seleucid king. This is probably an allusion to Antiochus Theos, a Seleucid king who reigned from around 261 to 246 BCE. His reign is largely marked by the Second Syrian War between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. This war was concluded with a marriage. Antiochus Theos sent his own wife into exile and married Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy II. After Ptolemy II dies, Antiochus kicks Bernice to the curb and takes his old wife back. Of course, in perfect soap opera style, his first wife, Laodice, poisons and kills Antiochus Theos. And this whole series of events leads to a succession problem, which leads to the Third Syrian War. Verses 7 through 12 allude to the Third Syrian War. Ptolemy III invades the Seleucid Empire to install the son of Bernice as king. He beats up the Seleucids. Unfortunately, by the time he gets to Antioch, Bernice and her children have been killed. Ptolemy III has so much success in this war that the Seleucid Empire is almost wiped out. He occupies Antioch for a while, and it appears that he reached Babylon before the war ended. Verses 13 through 19 refer to Antiochus the Great. In around 219, Antiochus began the Fourth Syrian War and took back many of the coastal cities that had previously been lost to the Ptolemies. However, in 217, when trying to invade Egypt himself, Antiochus got beat up pretty good, and this war ended. In around 209 BCE, Antiochus went to war against Bactria and beat them up pretty good. This war was settled with an arranged marriage between one of the daughters of Antiochus and the son of the king of Bactria. This marriage and the following peace allowed Antiochus the Great to focus all of his attention to the west again. Antiochus expanded the Seleucid Empire greatly and picked another fight with the Ptolemies. This would be the Fifth Syrian War, and this time Antiochus the Great ran wild through most of the Ptolemaic Empire outside of Egypt. In 200, Antiochus the Great was planning on invading Egypt again, but this time the Romans told him that it wasn't a good idea and threatened him with war. So the Fifth Syrian War did not include Egypt itself. It should be noted that Rome's primary problem with any invasion of Egypt is that Rome received much of its grain from Egypt. Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome, and the Romans didn't want that connection disrupted. A bit later, the expansion under Antiochus into Greece would bring him at odds with Rome. The Roman Republic beat up the Seleucids pretty good and forced the Seleucids to pay a heavy tribute. Antiochus died the following year in 187. Seleucus Philopator was the next king. His rule was marked primarily by heavy taxation to pay off the Roman tribute. At this point, this chapter is showing an amount of precision that the rest of the book simply lacks. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was the next king. His rise to power was marked by murder and intrigue, and a couple of other potential kings had to be killed in the process. Antiochus Epiphanes launched an invasion of Egypt. This would be the Sixth Syrian War, and he whipped Egypt pretty good. He essentially took the entire empire, but in order to placate the Romans, he left the Ptolemies intact and pulled out. On his way back home, he sacked Jerusalem, set up a puppet high priest, and Antiochus Epiphanes is said to have rededicated the Temple of Jerusalem to Zeus. In 168 BCE, Antiochus Epiphanes decided to attack Egypt again, but this time the Romans told him it wasn't a good idea, so Antiochus pulled back without invading Egypt. This army, after being turned around by the Romans, sacked Jerusalem a second time. The rest of this chapter simply explains some of the exploits of Antiochus Epiphanes, particularly his actions towards Palestine and Jerusalem. Antiochus Epiphanes is a very evil person to this author, and it makes sense. Antiochus Epiphanes sacked Jerusalem twice and caused all kinds of problems for the Jews. Despite having some holes in the Persian kings list, this chapter is the most complete and comprehensive allegory I've seen in the entire book of Daniel. The author may not have a good grasp of Babylonian and Persian kings, but he definitely has some knowledge of the Seleucid Empire, and his list of kings from Antiochus Theos to Antiochus Epiphanes is fairly solid. At this point, I'd like to mention chapter 12. This chapter is the figurative end. It gives a time frame for the occupation of Jerusalem by Antiochus Epiphanes. However, at this point, I have no solid reference for those time frames. Chapter 12 ends up being the figurative end of Antiochus Epiphanes, the end of Seleucid dominance, and the end of a turbulent period for Palestine and Jerusalem.